Thank you everyone for staying at our AWM Pitt Grad seminar. Our next speaker is Melinda Kleczynski. She is a PhD student from University of Delaware. Her topic is the construction and interpretation of pollination resource complexes. Melinda, you can go ahead.
All right, before I start my presentation, can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
All right, so my name's Melinda, and I'd like to talk to you about some research I'm doing with my advisor, Chad Giusti. And we study some applications of topological data analysis to problems in ecology. And specifically today, I'd like to talk about the construction and interpretation of pollination resource complexes. Before I get started, I want to thank the University of Delaware for giving me some funding this year to work on problems like this, and also the members of the Aeroecology program. They're collaborators of mine on another project, and they've given me some good feedback on this work as well. That was really useful to me. And I'd like to mention that the foundation of a lot of the work I'll discuss today comes from this niche hierarchy work. So if you get to the end of the presentation and you're really interested in these mathematical techniques, this is a great resource for learning more about those. And finally, before we start on the math, I just wanted to mention that this is a really general technique. You can use this on a lot of different types of data sets. But the reason I decided to focus on plant-pollinator interactions is because of how important pollinators are to biodiversity and agriculture. So it's really beneficial to us to understand these systems well. All right, let's get started now. So this presentation will be in two parts. First, I will talk about the construction of resource complexes, and then we'll talk towards the end about some finer points of the interpretation of the results. So I want to start off from the concept of a graph. So a graph is just made up of vertices and edges, and then an edge will connect two of the vertices. And we'll say for our purposes today that those vertices are distinct. And here's an example of a graph. In particular, this is a bipartite graph because it has two classes of vertices. And this is actually a frequent way to visualize plant pollinator communities. So each vertex on the left is a different type of plant. Each vertex on the right is a different type of pollinator. And we add an edge between two vertices when that pollinator is a pollinator for that plant in this particular community. And here the pollinators are going to be animals. And for a lot of the data sets that I work with, the specific animals are insects. So I will sort of use pollinator, animal, and insect interchangeably in this presentation. And you can see some sorts of structure really well with this graph representation, but other types of features are harder to find here. So we will extend from the idea of a graph to a simplicial complex. And again, your components in a graph are vertices and edges. We can think of a vertex as a set containing one vertex. And you can think of an edge as a set containing two vertices. The two vertices that edge connects together, we can call them the endpoints of that edge. And then we can continue that pattern. So we can allow sets of larger numbers of vertices. And these will be the components of a simplicial complex. And now we call each of these a simplex. So a vertex is a 0 simplex, an edge is a 1 simplex, and in general, a set of k plus 1 vertices is a k simplex. It might seem like the numbering is a little off. So here, k is not the number of vertices. You can think of k as like the dimension. So, oh, was there a question? Okay, I'll keep going. So an edge, you can think of it being like one-dimensional. So then that's why it's denoted as a 1 simplex. And we secretly have a consistency requirement in a graph, So you can't have an edge in your graph unless the endpoints of that edge are vertices of your graph. We have a requirement for a simplicial complex as well, similar to that. So we call that downward closure. Basically, the simplicial complex is closed undertaking subsets. So if ABC is a simplex, then AB also has to be a simplex, and so on. And we are going to use these constructions to talk about shared resource use. So I have a graph on the left and a simplicial complex on the right, and these both came from the same set of data. And for both of these, I have resources as a vertex set. And on the left, we add an edge between two resources whenever they share a common consumer. So for example, maybe the resources are movies, and then you would have an edge between two vertices when there's a single person who watches both of those movies. And what I've done in the simplicial complex is we want to consider shared resource use among larger numbers of resources. So I also have some triangles shaded in on the right, and those correspond to two simplices that are added into the resource complex whenever we have three resources that share a common consumer. And we can see some more structure in the resource complex that's harder to see in a graph representation. So we have this empty gap in the middle of the resource complex. And this is okay to see on a slide for this example because it's not a very big data set and it's a low dimensional feature, but as I'm sure you can imagine, this gets harder to see just by drawing if you have high dimensional data or a larger data set. Yes, question.
Quick clarification.
Yeah.
How did you decide how to arrange your resources in this 2D image?
Right. So because I generated this myself, I had coordinates for the data points. In general, we're going to talk about using homology to actually find these features. So we will not actually use coordinate information to find any of the topological features. I will choose coordinates for vertices so we can actually look at some of these things, but the coordinates don't mean anything mathematically. They're just used to visualize. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So if we want to characterize a simplicial complex, drawing is not going to be a scalable way to do that. But we can characterize the complex using something called homology groups. And I'm not going to get into computations a lot in this presentation, but I will mention that the way you'll actually do this in practice is that we will take coefficients in a field, and then the homology groups will get the structure of a vector space, which is great because then this all turns into linear algebra and computers can do the computations for us. And specifically, one thing that's very useful is that the dimensions of these homology groups give us information about important features of the space. So the dimension of H0 gives us the number of path components, and the dimension of HK gives us the number of k-dimensional holes, where k is at least 1. Okay, so I think it's time to talk about an example. And I know this is a talk about plant pollinator communities, but before we get to that, I want to do an example that is a little more concrete and visual, and that actually has some coordinate information so we can actually look at this really well. So for our example, we're going to say that we have some garden areas, and each garden is characterized by the amount of sunlight that it receives and the typical amount of water or moisture there. So each garden has two numbers associated with it. So each garden will just display as a point. And then let's say we have a bunch of plants we want to introduce, and each plant has a range of sunlight it's okay with and a range of water that it likes. And just to keep things simple, this is just an example. We'll assume those two things are independent. So That means the preferences of each plant can be depicted as one of these rectangles. And a plant would be happy at any garden that falls inside that rectangle. So what we're going to do for the resource is going to be the garden, and then our plants are going to be consumers. And the way that we'll build up a resource complex is that each consumer or each plant will be associated with a simplex whose vertices are the resources that it utilizes. So I have a few examples here. So in the bottom left of a plot, we have a plant that only likes one of the gardens. So that plant brings a 0 simplex into the resource complex. And the vertex comes from the garden that plant is okay living in. And we have a plant to the right of the plot that's a little more flexible. It likes 2 of the gardens. So we will associate that plant with a simplex on those 2 vertices, which will actually be a 1 simplex or an edge. And then at the top of the plot, we have a plant that is okay in 3 of the gardens. It uses those 3 resources. So we will associate that plant with a simplex on those 3 vertices. And I won't always say this explicitly, but anytime you have a simplex, you have to include any of the subsimplices because of the downward closure requirement of a simplicial complex. So up at the top, I have a 2 simplex, so I have to automatically include the associated edges and vertices. Okay, let's say you want more than 3 plants. So let's say these are all the plants that you want. And we would get the resource complex on the right. And resource complexes are all about resource use. So I don't include a vertex in my resource complex unless the resource associated with that vertex is actually being used by at least one of the consumers. So if you look at the plot on the left, we haven't planned our garden area very well, and there's a garden that none of the plants would actually survive in. So that resource is not being used. So that vertex in that bottom right corner of the plot is not in the resource complex because none of the consumers in this case, which are plants, would actually use it. Okay, so what sorts of things can we use this construction to analyze? So I'll call your attention to the garden in the middle of this plot. It's pretty moderate in terms of both of the variables, water and light. And what's interesting about it is that it follows in the intersection of a lot of these rectangles. So a lot of different plants would be happy in this garden. And it's the only resource that follows in the intersection of those rectangles. So if I take it out, now I have a 1-dimensional hole in my resource complex. And I could detect that by checking the homology. And that's an interesting application because now this missing resource is reflected in the topology of the resource complex. So if I had these holes in my resource complex, that might represent that there is a potential missing resource there. Now, you may be wondering why we have to use resource complexes to detect that. I mean, we had a scatter plot, so why can't we just look at the plot and be like, there are no points close to the middle of the plot, so maybe there's a missing resource there. Well, it turns out in practice, we want to use this with a lot of data sets where we don't have coordinate information. But the great thing about this construction is that we can find the dimensions of the homology groups. Even if we don't have that coordinate data, we don't even need to know what space our data comes from. We just need to know which interactions are occurring. So in this case, we would need to know which gardens would be suitable for any of the given plants. So basically, if you have enough information to make a bipartite graph, you can make a resource complex, which is great because for this plant-pollinator interaction data, we have the information to make a bipartite graph. So here's an example of this kind of data set. So this is just a small data set we collected at the University of Delaware for the purposes of illustrating this kind of mathematical construction. So Each vertex on the left is a different genus of plant. Each vertex on the right is a different genus of insect. And there's an edge between two vertices whenever that insect visited a flower on a plant from that genus. So for example, the edge between A4 and P5 means that there was a honeybee that visited a sunflower. And just because of time constraints, I'm going to treat this as binary interaction data during this presentation, but I do want to mention that in general, you can take into account that there are varying interaction strengths, like the one you can see on this bipartite graph here, and that gives you a lot of additional structure, but we just won't have time for that today. But let's go ahead and make a resource complex. So I still have my plants as simplices like I did in the previous example, but my resources are not garden areas anymore. Now my resources are the different insects or animals, and they are resources because they are providing pollination services to these different plants. And I've roughly color-coded the plants here, but there's a lot of overlap, so I'll show some individually. So here's an example. So we have this plant genus, and all of the animals in orange visited flowers on this genus of plant. And then how I build up the resource complex is I associate a simplex to that plant genus, and the vertices of that simplex are the animals that visited the flowers of that plant genus. And I do that for every genus of plant, and between all of them, that builds up the entire resource complex. Now, I also have this resource complex. So pollination is interesting because it's a mutualistic interaction. The plants are getting something, they're getting pollination services, but the animals are getting something too. They're getting food in the form of nectar and pollen. So I could actually reasonably take either group as my vertex set. So now I have the plants are vertices and the animals are simplices. So here's an example. So this genus of insect, this is a pollinating fly. It visited flowers on these three plant genera. So it corresponds to this simplex. And another insect that was present at this garden was Apis mellifera, so the western honeybee. And it actually visited all but one of the plants. So this resource complex is almost just one giant simplex. And if I look at another insect genus, genus Bombus, which is bumblebees, it just visited these three plants. And those three plants were actually also visited by the honeybee we had in the previous slide. So if we look at these two side by side, the small Bombus simplex on the right is actually a subsimplex of the large Apis simplex on the left. And we have that downward closure requirement for a simplicial complex. So we actually needed to include that simplex anyway, as soon as we have the large Apis simplex on the left. So for the purpose of this particular resource complex, the homology doesn't change whether you have the bumblebees there or not. I do want to say in defense of the bumblebees that it does matter when you take into account interaction strengths, but if you treat everything as a binary, did they interact or did they not, then the bumblebees didn't change the construction here. Now, because the honeybees, genus Apis, were obscuring a lot of structure, we might try to take them out and see what's left. So this is the resource complex without the honeybees there. And now we have these holes present, which I think is interesting because Apis mellifera, which was the representative of genus Apis in this data set, is not a native species in this area. So it's interesting that you take it out and then we have these holes. Like maybe there were holes in the resource complex and that made it easier for that species to establish here. Or maybe resource complexes just frequently look like this. This is the kind of question we can consider now that we have these constructions. And another thing that's interesting here is that both of these resource complexes, with the animals as vertices or with the plants as vertices, have the same homology. They both have one component and two topological holes. And it turns out that always happens. So Dowker's theorem tells us that no matter which set you take as your vertex set, you're going to get the same homology, which I think is awesome mathematically. It's also awesome computationally because now we don't have to do everything twice. Okay, I know we're approaching the end of the day on Friday, so I won't spend a lot of time on interpretation, but I wanted to just point out a couple subtle things that can happen. So let's say you found a significant topological feature, like maybe you found a topological hole. You're tempted to conclude that hole in the resource complex means a missing resource, which in this case could be a plant or a pollinator. It does turn out there are some other possibilities. So we don't know the true system. We know data that was observed from the system. So that can introduce some additional phenomena. So for example, in order to know an interaction as part of our data set, we had to identify the insect and the plant that were a part of that interaction, which can be difficult. So if we're trying to identify insects visually, a lot of them look similar. So in practice, you may have to group them together. So in this example, insects D and E, if they look very similar, and we have to just group them together and say insects D/E visits plant 1 and 4, then that actually adds a spurious edge. And we've actually created this topological hole because of the way that we've had to collect our data. Something similar can happen if you are trying to get a robust large data set. So you collect data from multiple sites and merge that together. You can actually create topological holes by doing that as well. And it's not just the data collection that can make things tricky. There are also different ecological phenomena that can create topological holes as well beyond just missing resources. So for example, if insects change their behavior based on context, like maybe in this scenario, this insect visits more types of plants when resources are scarce. But if resources are plentiful, it just focuses on its favorite plants. That can actually create a topological hole as well. So in the resource complex on the right, there is a topological hole, but that does not mean there's a missing resource. Everyone is actually happier in that scenario. So it gets pretty interesting trying to analyze these results. But I think we're at the end of our time, so I will stop there and just take any questions you might have. All right, I see the first question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Before that, let me stop the record.